My guests today are Amy Wood and Greg Belliston. Amy is a partner of Cooley down in San Diego, where she is chair of the firm's compensation and benefits practice group. Amy has been a fixture at my annual proxy season conference and is one of the nicest people I know. Greg is assistant general counsel and assistant corporate secretary at Nu Skin out in Provo, Utah. Greg is like me, someone who has done the trifecta of practicing in this area: government, a former SEC staffer in Corp Fin, who then had some nice years at a law firm, Gibson Dunn, before going in-house. Greg is deeply involved in working with the compensation arrangements for the Nu Skin executives, so his viewpoint here is invaluable. I'm Brock Romanak, today on Zippy Point. Amy and Greg, we're going to talk about the Outstanding Equity Awards table, and we're going to start by digging right into item 402.
That sounds great.
And the first column here is the named executive officers, and I have a separate Vid-Guide where we discuss how to determine who your named executive officers are, your NEOs. So Amy, why don't we start with the column next to that, the number of securities underlying the unexercised options.
Hey Brock, could I cut in real quick and just, because I was trying to do my duty to provide a little bit of humor for this presentation. So with respect to the name column, I did a Google search to see if I could find any funny nicknames that companies have used for their NEOs over the years. And I actually found a hit. There was a website called Top 10 Nicknames in SEC History. And I looked at it, but when I discovered that number one was Johnny Football, I discovered it was talking about a different SEC. It was talking about football players in the Southeastern Conference, and not the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I've got nothing with humor, as it turned out. With that, I'll let Amy go ahead with the other columns.
I'm so disappointed. I couldn't wait to hear it and thought I've been missing out. But that's all right. Well, I'll look at the football list. So let's see. So this table, we're dealing with a snapshot of all of the outstanding awards by each NEO as of the end of the year. In this table, we're going to divide it into options and stock awards separately. We're going to then further divide stock awards into time-based and performance-based. But we start with options here, and then the first two columns are divided into the number of shares underlying options that are exercisable and number of shares underlying options that are unexercisable. And then there's also a requirement for the unexercisable column to describe the vesting schedule in a footnote. Unexercisable technically does mean unexercisable. It doesn't mean they don't use the word unvested. So it's pretty rare to have an early exercise feature on a public company stock option, but to the extent you do, just keep in mind that distinction that we're dealing with exercisable and unexercisable. Typically it'll sync up with vesting. Sometimes it may not. Once we go through getting the shares in the right column there for exercisable and unexercisable, then we move over to the option exercise price and the option expiration date. The expiration date, of course, is just the full term of the option, assuming it goes its maximum 10-year or 7-year, whatever the maximum term is, assuming the person's service continues through that entire period. Then we move over.
I would just point out before you move to stock awards, a point about the option awards that are reported under the equity incentive plan column. The general rule is you're reporting those at the threshold amount. But you are allowed, and you should take the previous year's actual performance into account in this, because you're preparing the table after year end. So if you have options that are contingent on the prior year's performance, if the prior year's performance is above threshold level, then the number you should put in that column is the target number. And if prior year performance is higher than target, then you put the maximum number in that table. So it requires a little bit of thought and analysis. It's not just a number that's always going to flow from whatever your report you're using to compile the table.
That's a great point. Great point. And kind of dusting off that rule each year, and looking at the CD&I is a great idea, so that you can make sure that you're getting that correct if there has been actual performance that should flow through. As we then move over to stock awards, so RSAs, RSUs, PSUs, performance stock awards, anything that you may have that's not a stock option, the first two columns are we're dealing with time-based awards here. So this is pretty straightforward. We're dealing first just with the number of shares underlying the award that have not vested. Something that has vested isn't going to be an outstanding award for purposes of this table anymore. So we've got the number of shares that have not vested, and then the market value of those shares in the next column. So this will be a dollar value, and this is simply the number of shares multiplied by the closing stock price on the last day of your fiscal year. From there, we will move to performance-based awards. So this is going to be stock awards subject to performance vesting that has not yet occurred. And that's going to be our last two columns. So we're going to have equity incentive plan awards where we include the number of unearned shares, units, or other rights that have not yet vested as a share number. And then we're going to do the same thing and turn that into a dollar value. That is simply going to be that share number times the closing stock price on the last day of the fiscal year.
So Greg, why don't we look at New Skin's proxy, your table? Considerably long.
Yeah, this it can be a very long table. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, and it covers all outstanding awards as of the end of the year. So it can go back in time a little ways. We don't, at my company, we haven't had performance-based stock awards for a while. So those have all phased out, and we don't have any outstanding. So we omit those last two columns of the table that Amy described. And then if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see the footnotes. As Amy mentioned, you're supposed to disclose in the footnotes the vesting dates for the awards. And those are pretty lengthy, at least in my company's case. There's a lot to say. We do follow kind of same general parameters, usually from year to year, but there are often some details in some years that require some separate explanation. So those footnotes get pretty lengthy.
And it's a beautiful proxy design and makes it so easy to read when you have multicolor and charts for these footnotes. So kudos to making it easy for investors to understand what you're doing here.
Yeah, and along those lines, this is, I would say, not an area that gets a lot of attention in terms of maybe being called out as a new chart or graph or a nice design element that a company put effort into that was noticeable. But I think I'm sure it is, even if it doesn't get called out. This is a really well-designed table, and it's so organized and easy to get the information that you want. And that particularly stands out because this is a table that can just get so long and unwieldy. And if you have NEOs who have long-standing tenure and have a lot of awards, and then you don't put the effort into organizing it, this can be really hard to figure out. So yours is really well done.
Oh, thanks. It's something we've tried to improve over the past few years. We were much more just black and white and zero graphics, 5 or so years ago, but we have tried to improve the readability of our proxy statement recently. And that is something that I've noticed. Those footnotes, you need to look at them every year and just make sure that they're correctly describing everything. They're easy to ignore, but you shouldn't ignore them.
So Greg, what are diligence and data do you need to collect in advance in order to fill out this table?
The main thing that I use to fill out the table is a report. I just asked my stock plan administrator for a report of all the outstanding awards as of the end of the year. Because really all this table is that report just translated into the SEC's format. So that's where I get the vast majority of the data for this table. I also have the comp committee minutes handy while I'm working on it. Because if I have questions about a particular award, I'll go to the minutes, or that issue that I mentioned a few minutes ago about reporting performance-based awards. at threshold, or sometimes at target or maximum, depending on the prior year's performance. The minutes have the terms of the grant, and they'll say what those performance levels were. And the minutes also have the vesting information that is needed for the footnotes. The only other real piece of data you need is the closing stock price as of the end of the year, so that you can calculate the market value of those stock awards.
And what are common areas where you see folks get tripped up and make mistakes when dealing with this table?
Oh, typos. That's the first thing that comes to mind with this table. That's the first thing, because when I think of the pitfalls of this table, it's just such a long table, potentially a long table, lots of numbers in it. So just by the law of averages, there's a good chance that you're going to have a typo somewhere. So just proofread it and get a second set of eyes on it as well. Another pointer I would give is, if you're using a stock plan administrator report to compile the table, like I do, just know what that report is and isn't saying. For example, it might have the report might have a column where it states the amount of awards vested, for the amount of options that have vested for a particular award. But don't just automatically take that number and put it into that first column, that exercisable column, because the report might be saying the number that have vested over the total life cycle of that award, and maybe some of them have already been exercised, so they're no longer outstanding and shouldn't be in the table. So just know what the stock plan administrator report is and is not saying. And then a couple of just compliance points are, remember that you need to footnote the vesting dates for all the awards. If you're just rolling forward last year's table and footnotes, this could be an easy thing to overlook, because last year may have had all the vesting information for the older awards that were outstanding at that time, but you need to remember to put the vesting information in for the awards that were made just during the most recent year. And then just on the issue about disclosing incentive plan awards at threshold as a general rule, that's something that's not always picked up in stock plan administrator reports, or from, if you're using proxy tables that your broker, the broker who helps with your administration, provided. Those little nuances sometimes aren't reflected in those types of reports and tables.
I think it's such good advice to really focus on proofreading this table, because it is sort of easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, a lot of this I'm just bringing it forward from the past. Those same awards are outstanding, and not to, and they're often, there's just dense. There's so much information in here, but kind of going through and proofreading is important. And then I would also maybe just add that, just kind of thinking, making sure it makes sense, just so you can, this is also one where you can get lulled into just doing it the same as last year. But when you're looking at what you're bringing forward, and then the other resources that Greg talked about, just kind of make sure it makes sense. And sometimes I think where I'll discover that something's not accurate, and we try to figure out, well, how do we get there in the first place? Maybe it even is a carry forward of an error from a prior year. One thing that happens occasionally, and Greg, I don't know if you deal with this depending on your stock admin software, but sometimes the stock admin team needs to do some sort of manual workaround to get it to do what they need, that then when it goes into the report that you're looking at that has everything outstanding at the end of the year, it's not quite what it is, and they know what it is, the stock admin team, it's sort of meeting their need, but it might not be technically accurate for purposes of this table. And so just, it's particularly that happens sometimes with performance awards or anything that's a little different, that doesn't fall neatly into a box. So that's the part, I think, just make sure that kind of focus on proofreading the kind of nitty gritty level, but also make sure it makes sense. The other thing that can come up that that can change year over year. I think there are a few things that can come up that can cause you to need to change, to not just roll forward. That might be an award that was outstanding previously as a performance award, but now it's just, it's into time-based vesting if you have kind of a hybrid award. So you might need to take the same award and change columns in addition to changing what's vested and unvested or exercisable and unexercisable. Also, if you have an NEO who departed during the year, that would change the termination dates for that person's options probably. And so focusing on that and not using the original 10-year term, but using at the year end, what was the termination date for those options, probably going to be a lot shorter than it originally was, at least for some. And then the other thing that can happen during the year, it's pretty rare that there are stock dividends on outstanding stock awards, and it's got to be sort of unvested stock that's awarded in the form of a dividend on the unexercised stock awards. But if you have that, I'll just flag it as an issue, and there's a CDI on point, and you can dig into the technicalities of how that should be reported in this table.
So Amy, how much do investors care about this table?
So the reason they care about this table is to the extent they're thinking about what the NEOs have a little more holistically and long-term, and not just what you granted in the prior year, but they're looking at overall what's realizable for an NEO or for all of the NEOs. They also might be interested in looking at when options are vesting, are those being immediately exercised, or are NEOs holding on to those unexercised options? You can glean that information from this table. The proxy advisory firms, everyone is probably familiar, have their methodology to look at what's realizable. But if an investor isn't going to want to rely on one of those methods of calculating what's realizable, or maybe if you're presenting a story in your CD&A that gets into what's realizable, but they don't like your methodology or want to consider another methodology, this table is where you can go to get the underlying raw data, and the investor can look at it in the way that they want to.
So Greg, I got to ask you, where does this table fall on your fun scale?
Well, it's not all that fun. Even by compensation table standards, this isn't a really exciting table. Yeah, I got nothing on this.
This one feels like one that it's sort of thankless, right? It takes a ton of work. But there's something that's kind of thankless and less satisfying than the other tables when you dig in and get it all done, at least for me.
It doesn't bring me joy, so maybe I should.
Well, thank you very much, Greg and Amy. That was great.
Thank you.